Hi, I'm Amber, and welcome to the Lone Star Keto Podcast. Today, we have a very special guest with us. His name is Sam Apple, and he is the author of this book right here. And we're going to discuss about cancer and how the diet plays a role in that. So it's specifically insulin and sugar. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Okay, so I find this really interesting. Sam is actually a fellow Texan, a native Texan at that. And so can you give us a little bit of your background and to where you started compared to where you are right now and what you were doing currently?
Sure. So I grew up in Houston. I remain a huge Houston Rockets fan, even though I now live in the Philadelphia suburbs. And I moved around a bit over the years, but starting in college, I began my writing career, and I've been working in publications and writing books, for much of the last 20 years. And I now teach science writing and creative writing in the master's programs at Johns Hopkins. So, when I'm not working on books, I'm mostly teaching writing.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to mainly be talking about Ravenous, the book. I'm curious. Number one, how did you come up with that title, and why did you choose to write the subject that you did?
Sure. The title, it honestly wasn't my first choice. We went back and forth on a few different ideas. I was originally going to call it A Disease of Civilization, but my publisher said that was too heavy. So we ended up trying some other names, and we came up with the Ravenous, which I do really like. And first and foremost, it refers to the way that a cancer cell takes up glucose. That's one of the central topics in my book. And cancer cells, as many people in the audience may know, are unusual in the way they take up glucose. They take up much more than an ordinary cell. And it's now one of the most important diagnostic techniques is a PET scan, which really looks at where in the body cells are taking up more glucose, and that's where you have cancer. So it was in reference to that, but then I also tell, the first person to make this discovery of how cancer cells eat was the German scientist Otto Warburg, who is, the main personality in my book. And Warburg also, could be described as ravenous because of his, ravenous quest for fame and for scientific greatness. So it worked in that way as well. And then I also write about the Nazis and Hitler, and so sort of ravenous works in that context as well, I think. So first and foremost, it's a reference to the cancer cells, but I hope it has some other sort of thematic connections.
Absolutely. Okay, so tell us a little bit more about what the book is about.
Sure. So, it's, in my mind, it's interesting to hear other people say what they think it's about. And, because it's partially a biography and partially history, people have different opinions. But in my mind, it's about a fundamental mystery, which is why cancer remains such a common disease, despite all the work we've done in the last century to try to prevent and cure it. And the mysterious part in my mind is that when you look back to the 19th century, you see in the first part of the century, cancer is relatively rare. It certainly exists. It's probably always existed in some form or another, and it exists in many different species. So cancer has always existed, but it was a fairly uncommon disease prior to, the middle, I would say, of the 19th century. And then it just becomes more and more common. And, there's this tremendous growth throughout the 20th century. And we know some of the reasons that this happened. Smoking played a big role in lung cancer, and, various other things may contributed from alcohol consumption to sun exposure and chemicals in the air. But, I think that we haven't fully explained the rise of cancer in the 20th century. So I was trying to, explore whether diet could be sort of the missing link. There's all sorts of hypotheses about different chemicals in our food might be causing cancer, and all those things may play a role, but I was exploring the hypothesis that diet played a role ultimately through driving insulin resistance and elevated insulin levels. And I think that, the last part of my book and is really kind of my attempt to put it all together. And that's where I make the argument that cancer may be a disease of civilization, a disease that became much more common because insulin resistance and elevated insulin became much more common. And that may be driving, certainly not all cancers, but a considerable portion of our cancer burden.
So why do you think that, you went back and you explored this particular scientist, what he was doing and all. And the scientists we have today who supposedly are working night and day trying to find a cure for cancer, but yet there's really not one. Okay, chemo does some, I guess, but why do you think that is? Why can we not find a cure? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's, in my book, I focus mostly on cancer prevention. Why we can't find a cure, I would say that's a really, it's a critical question outside of my area of expertise. But, I think part of the answer is that, cancer is an incredibly difficult and complicated disease. And, what in the 1970s and 80s, they started to discover that mutations had a role in cancer. And that was an important discovery. But, the original dream was that you were just going to target a mutation, turn that off, and you would stop cancer. But it hasn't really worked with, a couple notable exceptions. And it's in part because, these cancer cells, one cancer may have many, many different mutations. And, there's this selective process where the cancer is kind of mutating, and you can't really stop a cancer that way. So we kind of went down the wrong path, I think, for decades. And the return to metabolism, which is, a big part of my book, I'm hopeful that that's going to lead to some, really powerful new therapies, and certainly dietary therapy in conjunction with other therapies is looking really promising. But my focus is really on prevention in terms of why haven't we prevented cancer? And I think that has a lot to do with why we, a failure to appreciate the role of diet and insulin resistance.
I agree with you. Of course, I'm not a scientist, but okay. Can you go back and talk a little bit about this person that you wrote the story about, basically the history part, Wahlberg, and what is the Wahlberg effect?
Yeah, so Otto Warburg was a German scientist who in 1923 made this discovery that I referenced before, that cancer cells have this unusual appetite, whereas a normal cell takes up glucose and burns it in the mitochondria with oxygen. That's cellular respiration. That's why we breathe. We take in the oxygen and we, essentially really do burn it. And it's a wonderful process. It gives us a lot of energy, a lot of ATP that the cell can use. But we have what I call in the book, these backup generators, this ability to use the glucose we consume without oxygen. And it's called fermentation in general terms. And it's the same thing that, that microorganisms do. They give us, all the foods that we love, and beer and wine and yogurt and cheese. It's just a very quick way of breaking down glucose. And, some animals give off alcohol. Some organisms give off alcohol and carbon dioxide. We ferment our glucose, humans, into lactic acid. So what Warburg discovered was that cancer cells were doing this fermentation, were taking up a lot of glucose. And it seemed, really strange and surprising to him because, a cancer cell needs a lot of energy to grow and make copies of itself. So you would expect it, if anything, to do more respiration, more burning with oxygen, but instead they were doing, more of this fermentation. So that, was a really strange thing. And to this day, scientists are trying to understand why cancer cells do this. What advantage does it give the cancer cell? And, those are all important questions. But the question that I was most focused on is, does something about the way we eat allow a cancer cell to gain this advantage, to be able to take up all that glucose? The simple answer would be just eating a lot of carbohydrates, because carbohydrates, of course, break down to glucose. But I don't think it's quite that simple. There's always a lot of glucose in our blood, or not a lot, but there's always glucose in the blood, even if you're on a keto diet. You would die very quickly if you didn't have glucose in your blood. So what I was interested in particular is how insulin allows cancer cells to overeat glucose. And, I think the heart of the story really comes down to insulin being at elevated levels, and then particular mutations in the cancer cell that allow it to become more responsive to insulin. The cancer cells have a lot of insulin receptors, and the most common mutations of all are the ones that allow a cancer cell to take over, to kind of respond to insulin and take up more glucose. So to me, that's really the key to the story. And Warburg discovered the first part in 1923, that cancer cells are doing this, but it took another, almost a full century to figure out the insulin part of it.
Wow. So by having chronically high insulin, it sounds like that in itself can cause or make the cancer express itself more, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, there's some debate over whether or not the elevated insulin is actually causing those initial mutations, initiating the cancer. But that's sort of controversial. But I think what's less controversial is that we all get these microscopic tumors that wouldn't necessarily have a chance to thrive, and those might have these mutations that make a cancer cell more responsive to insulin. So if you have hyperinsulinemia, you're going to be activating these pathways in the cancer cell and allowing a cancer that might never grow or might be wiped out from the immune system to survive and potentially grow and grow. So it's I use the analogy of fertilizer. It's like this fertilizer in your blood that allows these cancer cells, these seeds, to grow. And insulin is a growth factor. If you have a child that has type 1 diabetes and they're not getting insulin, they won't grow in the same way. They'll be like, what they call failure to thrive. So it's just, it's kind of obvious in a way that insulin would be a suspect in cancer. And it's closely related to another hormone, insulin, like growth factor 1, which having elevated insulin increases that too. And that's literally what makes us grow. Growth hormone leads to elevated insulin, like growth factor 1. So, it's elevated insulin is a real problem in terms of growth, and cancer is a disease of uncontrolled growth. So, on the one hand, it makes sense that it took us so long to figure this out, because we couldn't even measure insulin in the blood until about 1970. On the other hand, now that we have figured it out, it's kind of amazing that more cancer scientists aren't interested in this. Some are, but it's taking an amazingly long time.
Okay, call me a conspiracy theorist, whatever, but I can't help but think that in some way, money plays a part in this. And what I mean by that is it will benefit some people, to not find the cure and to not blame insulin, sugar, glucose, whatever, because it kind of goes back to what they're making money off of, whether it's other drugs or, the food companies, that kind of thing, who hold a lot of influence over research.
Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, I think, that the vast majority of cancer scientists certainly are very well-intentioned, that want to help people and find cures for cancer. But I think that's true, but it's also true that money certainly plays a role. Some examples are, there's just not money. Nobody wants to invest money in studying the ketogenic diet or a drug like metformin, because you can't profit it. So there's none of the pharma stuff going into it. So that's one way money plays a role. Another way is that these major cancer centers have huge investments in drugs that don't work particularly well and treatments that don't work particularly well. And they, promote them and make it seem like we're having this revolution in terms of targeting mutations with individual therapies. And, the reality is very different. So, I think most of the people involved have good intentions, and yet somehow the system, kind of pushes everybody in the wrong direction. And then, where you get to sort of more of black and white sort of, bad intentions, I would say is, sometimes in the, in the food world where they purposefully, try to muddy the science. You've seen that a lot with sugar stuff over the years, and that's different. And that, that upsets me more than anything, because, I think that, it's very hard to talk about, diet and to present the evidence without, food companies releasing studies that aren't well done or designed to confuse. So that's very frustrating.
It really is. And I find that very disturbing, but I mean, it's the reality, because without money, you can't do the research you need. So even though the scientist or the researcher, whatever, has these great intentions, you still have to have money to be able to do it, to function. So it does kind of make, to me, I think it's a very difficult thing. And there's, like you said, there is no profit in some of this research. And so is it your belief that the whole prevention thing could possibly be helped by going on a lower carb type of lifestyle?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. My book, I don't really give prescriptions on what people should do, but I think that's a pretty clear takeaway. If you buy my argument or take seriously the evidence that I present that hyperinsulinemia is playing a role in many different types of cancer. And I really don't think it should be controversial, because, obesity has been linked to 13 different types of cancer. And I think the insulin obesity link is pretty clear. So even if you don't necessarily buy the exact mechanism, I think that the link is pretty clear. So if you agree that hyperinsulinemia is driving cancer, then, the next obvious thing is, well, what would be the way to, make it so you don't have hyperinsulinemia and are less likely to get cancer? There's no guarantees anybody could get cancer. Sometimes it's bad luck, but to give yourself, vastly better odds, I think the most obvious thing to do would be to get your insulin levels down. So, the next question is, how do you do that? And, there are different ways, but the best way, the most obvious way, I think, is to, if you're already insulin resistant, which most of us are, is to cut back on carbohydrates, dramatically for some people. Some people might be able to tolerate more than others, but I think most of us could afford to cut back some. If you're perfectly metabolically healthy, maybe all you need to do is just avoid sugar, and you can get away with a lot more. So, it changes from person to person, but, the number one thing I think is to fix your insulin resistance. And as an added bonus, it will probably help you with 20 other conditions as well. So, I could have written a lot of this book about other diseases, but cancer was my focus.
Awesome. Okay, so I hear about how some cancers feed off glucose, but other cancers actually feed off ketones. Do you know anything about that, or what is your opinion of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that most cancers demonstrate this Warburg effect, this overeating of glucose. But, there are it's not the only nutrient. Cancers also need a source of nitrogen, for example, so they take up certain amino acids. And cancers, are also, they, as we talked about before, they evolve very quickly, and they can learn new tricks. And in some circumstances, they might, I don't think this would be true of many cancers, but some, in a laboratory setting, I believe have been shown to be able to consume ketones. So, I think the general advice would be that, not to assume that every cancer would have the exact same dietary therapy, and to make sure you do your research and talk to your doctors, your oncologists. But at the same time, I think that the most common and deadly cancers are likely to be ones that are driven by hyperinsulinemia. So just do it as the number one common sense thing, I think, would be to get your insulin down a bit. But certainly, I think it's important to make sure that your specific cancer would be one that you would want to approach with a dietary therapy. And I don't talk about that at all in my book, because I'm really focused on prevention. But there are a lot of
Right.
great resources online for people that are interested in that.
Yeah. So for preventative measures, it is, in your opinion, that cutting out the things that make insulin spike chronically would be to your best advantage.
Right.
That's kind of across the board, regardless of what cancer would take up ketones or whatever.
Yeah.
It's still the preventative part of it would be to keep your insulin level.
Yeah. And I focus primarily on sucrose, on sugar. It gets very confusing because a lot of my book is about glucose, and then I talk about sugar, and people sometimes refer to glucose as sugar because our blood glucose is called blood sugar. But I'm particularly focused on sucrose, the sweet white stuff, which is half glucose and half fructose. And really looks like, if you're already metabolically healthy, you can get away with some carbs if you avoid the fructose. But once you start adding in the sucrose, which is has that fructose molecule, then it really triggers all the problems that I think your audience probably knows a lot about, the added fat in around your liver and other organs. And then you start to see this process of insulin resistance beginning, and then suddenly you have many more times the insulin in your blood that you should. For a while, that will keep the glucose under control, but eventually you'll start to develop diabetes, and you'll have the insulin and the glucose together, and which is a horrible combination. You have the hormone insulin. The some cells might be resistant to it, but your cancer cells are not. In fact, they learn to take advantage of it. So there is no insulin resistance for cancer cells. There's only like insulin receptivity and more insulin available for them. So I think that drinking sugar appears to be worst of all in terms of contributing to the insulin resistance. But I think the best thing that people can do for step one is to avoid sugar, sucrose, and probably in most cases avoiding other carbs as well.
Okay, here lately, I've been getting a lot of flack when I put out any kind of a post that disses on sugar, as in the white stuff, the typical sugar, sucrose, saying that it's not really bad, that if you have it in moderation, sugar is fine. There's nothing really bad about it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're, again, about 88% of American adults have some degree of insulin resistance. So if we are, addressing the vast majority of us, then, it's one thing. If you're already metabolically healthy, then, and you're not overdoing it with sugar, yeah, I'm sure you can manage some. But if you want to reverse your insulin resistance, then it just makes sense that sugar's got to go. And if you're not pretty strict about it, then you don't lose the taste for it. So I think, going cold turkey is the way to go. But it's true that, you can probably get away with a little bit, particularly if you're exercising and restricting other carbs. But, I was listening to Gerald Schulman, this, one of the world's experts on insulin resistance at Yale, and he was talking about, he does all these tests on Yale undergraduates, and they all tend to be insulin resistant already by the time they make it to Yale. So, it's all of us. And if we're going to fix it, we have to start with the sugar.
I agree. Now, just out of curiosity, where do you think seed oils fall in all of this?
I know that's, certainly an important part of the story as well, but, I'm not an expert on that. I mean, I don't know that I'm an expert on any of this. I'm just a journalist, but I didn't focus on that part of the story as much. So I do think it's an important part of the story, and I recommend reading like Nina Teichel's Big Fat Surprise and other books for more information on that. But I don't talk about it as much just because I haven't done the research myself, and I like to wait to talk about things until I know more.
That could be your next book right there.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned, and you talked a little bit about this, of how obesity has a link to cancer. And I mean, let's face it, good gosh, obesity is like one of those markers for just about everything out there. It's like obesity, obesity, obesity. So could you explain how that is the case? Why is obesity linked to cancer?
Sure. One of the most interesting things that I discovered in my research is that, even at the very, very beginning of what I'll call the 200-year sort of rise of cancer, people were already sort of noticing that it tended to be more common in people who were a little overweight. And that observation was made again and again throughout the 19th century. And then in 1937, you have this massive tome by this world famous cancer statistician named Frederick Hoffman, and he concludes after like 700 pages that that's the real story, that what they called overnutrition. So this idea was out there for so long, and yet somehow in the late 20th century, it got kind of completely lost. And then only really in the 1990s did these new epidemiology, these population studies start to again make the link between obesity and cancer. And ever since, for the last 20 years, there's just been one study after the next, and the evidence is more and more convincing. They've now definitively linked 13 cancers to obesity. I think it's actually many more. Some where the evidence was a little less clear cut. They didn't include prostate cancer, but I think the link is pretty clear there as well. But they estimate, even with this sort of conservative estimate, that it's 600,000 or more cancer diagnoses a year linked to obesity. And again, I think it's more. And so the question is, why is that happening? One hypothesis is that the obesity itself is causing these cancers because our fat tissue actually functions like an endocrine organ and actually releases hormones of different kinds and chemical signals, which could contribute to cancer. But I think that, certainly that contributes to inflammation and is not a good thing and may have a role in all of this. But I think in some ways, focusing on that misses the more fundamental point, which is that the insulin, is probably doing both at the same time. It's driving the obesity and it's driving the cancer. So in a way, the obesity is kind of a distraction almost, because it's obviously hugely important, but it doesn't mean that obesity is causing cancer. It might be that insulin is causing obesity and insulin is causing cancer.
Yeah. And okay, so let's talk just a little bit about diabetes and cancer. I mean, it's pretty obvious where you're going with all this and the underlying issue with obesity, diabetes, and those kind of things.
Yeah.
But could you just describe it a little more detail of why diabetes could play a role in cancer or make you more susceptible to cancer?
Sure. Yeah. So, just to build on what I was saying before, you can think about it as insulin causing your adipose tissue, your fat tissue to grow and causing cancer cells to grow. And so, the question is, how do you end up with this elevated insulin that causes all this growth? And that connects it to diabetes. And diabetes, if you look back into the 19th century, the same story I told about cancer, could be told about diabetes. It was relatively rare disease. And then throughout the 19th century, starts to get a little more common. By the late 19th century, it gets very common, or not very common compared to today, not common at all, but more common. And then just throughout the 20th century, just like cancer. But, even to this day, they're thought of as two completely separate realms. It's just a coincidence that these two diseases and obesity tended to rise together throughout the decades. And so, as I think about it, that the fundamental issue in diabetes is the insulin resistance, is this problem where certain cells in the muscle and liver and eventually your fat tissue stop hearing insulin signal and the pancreas responds by producing more and more insulin. And so that is the diabetes. And then that elevated insulin in turn is driving the cancer and even more obesity. So they're all linked. I think, you could say two sides of the same coin, or, it's just this cluster of conditions that are all fundamentally, I think, the same thing. And, there's a great book by Ben Bickman, Why We Get Sick, which, he shows how it's not just cancer, obesity, and diabetes, but 10 other conditions. So, it's an extraordinary thing. And I think in a way, it makes all this so challenging, because if you're not sort of immersed in the science and you just hear people like you and me talking about it, I think this can't be true. Like, how could this one condition affect so many things? It's challenging, but I think with each passing year, the evidence that, insulin resistance is at the core of all these different chronic diseases is really clear.
Well, I agree with you based on the research I've done and what I've experienced myself. But for those who don't really understand some of the diseases that have insulin resistance as the root cause, can you kind of list some of those that you've come across in your research for those who may not really understand really what insulin resistance does?
Yeah. So when you have these elevated levels of insulin in your blood, I mean, the first thing to appreciate is that it's almost always missed by doctors, because, in the first decades of the disease, the insulin is actually successfully, insulin's job, or one of its key jobs, is to get the glucose in your blood into the cells, pushes it out of the blood into the cells, because if your glucose goes too high, then that's, horrible for your health and, potentially deadly. So you need the insulin to take care of that glucose. But, because it's keeping the glucose levels under control because the pancreas is releasing more and more insulin, it's keeping the glucose under control. And, you go to your doctor and you get your blood test and your glucose looks normal, but your doctor is not testing for the elevated insulin. So you have this elevated insulin for decades. Eventually, becomes apparent that you actually, are starting to get more of, the next stage, what I would call the next stage of diabetes, when the insulin can no longer control the glucose. And then, you start to see this condition cluster with all these other conditions. I don't know as much about many of the other conditions, but, the biggest one, are cardiovascular diseases also correlate very strongly. And then the mechanisms of how insulin contributes are pretty well understood. But then, it's also lots of less obvious things that, we often don't think about it, everything from skin tags on your body, which again, it makes sense. Like, insulin can act like a growth factor. It causes skin tags to grow. And, you have PCOS is related to this, and, all sorts of infertility issues, and, skin conditions, and just on and on. So, certainly, of course, fatty liver disease, and, the list goes on. So, I focus mostly on cancer, but I'm glad other people are covering the other aspects of it. And, I didn't even mention Alzheimer's, which, mention right. Alzheimer's increasingly, I think it's quite clear that there's a connection there as well.
So it seems to me that if you end up with things like diabetes, high blood pressure, PCOS, a cluster of these things, obviously you have an insulin resistant issue. That to me kind of gives you an idea that you might be a little more susceptible to possibly experiencing cancer.
Right.
Because the more you have, the more it's showing you have this insulin resistance. So it only makes sense. So,
and, the correlation between elevated insulin cancer, doctors recognizing that people who had elevated insulin were more likely to have cancer. That's been known for decades. But what's really new and fascinating is, in more recent years, we've done these cancer genome sequencing where you see exactly, which which cells are, which genes are mutated in a cancer cell. And, as I referenced before, it's actually the ones that are responsive to insulin are the ones that end up being mutated most often. And in insulin is, with each passing year, I think the connection between the two is becoming quite clear. It's sort of like in the 1980s, they started discovering all these mutations and signaling pathways in the cell. And when they did that, they left diet behind. But after, 30 years of research, that all led them right back to insulin because, this one enzyme in particular known as PI3K, that's the molecule inside the cell that responds to insulin. And that really appears to be at the heart of cancer. It's kind of like a master controller of the metabolism of a cell.
Is that something you can test for? Like, I know that like you can test and find out if you're susceptible to certain types of cancer, like say breast cancer. Like,
yeah.
Like Angelina Jolie, she tested for that and ended up, removing her breasts.
Yeah, it's a very good question. There are certain inherited mutations that increase your risk of cancer. To my knowledge, they're, in these metabolic pathways that I'm talking about, I don't think that there are any that could be tested for in that way. And it's an interesting question that I should look into more.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. But the bottom line is, if you're dealing with insulin resistance, you probably want to figure out how to correct that, improve it, if nothing else. I mean, sometimes you can't completely make it go away. Most of the time, I think you can. But, I'm sure there's always exceptions. But here's a question for you. Okay, knowing what you know now, what is your protocol? Like, how are you approaching it? Because after doing all this, you have to kind of go, I think I'm going to try to prevent this in the first place. So what is your method of prevention? What are you personally doing?
Sure. It's nothing too exciting. I'm just low carb, really, low carb, keto. I'm not as strict as some people perhaps, but I think I'm relatively strict. I certainly almost no sugar occasionally, like on my kids' birthdays. My kids get angry that I won't have any sugar, and they'll like shove a cupcake into my mouth and things like that. And I do like what's sometimes called like dirty keto. Like I'll have like a keto ice cream or Diet Coke or whatever. But I don't like to support Coca-Cola, but every now and then I have a diet drink. But I don't think there's one right way to do it. There are different approaches, but if it's working, if you're losing weight or reaching the weight that you want and you're feeling better, it's just a common sense thing. So I've been low carb for some time, but after doing the research on my book, it's made me all the more concerned and ready to stick to it. But and also knowing that with cancer, at least there are no guarantees. But I'd like to at least improve my odds, and it makes me feel good. I enjoy doing it, so I'm all for the low carb keto diet.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen, you probably have by now, but there's a new research out there about how horrible the keto diet is. It wrecks your health. I don't know if you've seen that one. It's laughable. I mean, like laughable.
Yeah, it's amazing to me that it feels like we're stuck in like some kind of time warp. It's the kind of stuff that you could have disproven decades ago. It's just so frustrating to see that kind of stuff still out there. But unfortunately, it just takes one kind of researcher with good connections to get it in the media, and then gets amplified. It's very frustrating.
It is extremely frustrating. Yeah. And you have all these, health gurus who are married to the old research stuff. Well, I mean, technically what we're talking about actually is old. I mean, we're talking way back, so really
Yeah.
we have the old diet that we're doing, this high carb, high, whatever you want to say, very plant-based diet is more of a recent thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And, certainly in the 19th century, they were already using low carb diets to control diabetes. So it's really nothing new in that respect.
Yeah. And it just makes you wonder why all of a sudden what was working now is all of a sudden deemed not good. But
Yeah.
I think it's starting to turn a little bit.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's been interesting for me to think about that in the context of cancer, because there are other hormones, the sex hormones that have been linked to cancer for decades. And there doesn't seem to be much controversy or resistance when it comes to talking about other hormones. But as soon as you bring in insulin, which is connected to diet, into the conversation,
Right.
suddenly like there's this extra skepticism. So there's clearly just this deeply ingrained bias against anything diet related, and it's hard to understand. I mean, I understand a little bit of it, that there have been, of course, and still are, some people who are quacks that say take this supplement or that supplement's going to cure your cancer, and that's not true, and that's given diet a bad reputation. But you can't, because of those people, you can't look away from all the very real science and all the very sort of intuitive connections between diet, insulin, and cancer.
Yeah. And that's what, I mean, how long has the saying been around? You are what you eat.
Yeah.
If you think about that, I just don't get why diet has to be so controversial. I mean, it's like religion or politics. It's like, it makes no sense to me, but
yeah. The good news is, though, it's starting to change. Just in Science Magazine recently did a big feature on cancer and diet, and that's as mainstream as you can get. And, I don't know if I could have written my book like in the 1980s, because, people weren't as open to some of this stuff. So it's changing, but, it's, the old cliche of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, so much resistance.
That is so true. And it still blows my mind. And the thing is, nutritional science is still pretty new. And the research as far as nutrition goes is pretty limited and not very good. I mean, it's very difficult to do any real research on how food affects you because of what you would have to do in order to get the real results. So we're, existing off of surveys. What did you eat 2 years ago on October 3rd? I mean, I could probably tell you now what I eat because I've been pretty consistent. But I mean, how many people can remember? I mean, I ate red meat 5 times a week, when maybe they only did twice, and they ate it with French fries. And,
it's incredibly frustrating. I think that's exactly what got us into this mess, is those kind of studies.
Agreed.
And even those kind of studies really didn't, prove that fat was harmful in any way. But, it's so easy to do those kind of studies and to, get the wrong answer. So, I think that's a big, part of the, the questions you were asking. A big part of the answer is, how we got here, and why diet isn't taken more seriously. It's because it's really incredibly hard to study. The surveys don't work, and the alternative, is to do a real controlled experiment where you have 2 groups of people, but you can't control people's diet for
exactly.
So
it's not ethical. You can't do it.
So
you have to lock somebody up and watch everything they did, and know, were they getting sunlight, were they, smoking a cigarette, whatever, because you don't know all these external things that could affect beyond eating meat or fat or whatever.
It's very hard to do. But what I hope people will realize is that what's less hard to do is to, see the link between obesity and cancer and elevated insulin cancer. That's much, less complicated. And then you just have to take 1 step back and say, okay, so what's causing obesity? And the science between sugar and obesity actually is pretty clear. So you can go sugar to obesity, insulin resistance to cancer. It doesn't take, you don't need all those problematic food studies to make those connections. But, a lot of people don't appreciate that, I think.
That's beautifully said. That's perfect. And you're exactly right. If you just take the steps and kind of go backwards, okay, we know that we know this. Okay, how do you deal with this? How do you deal with that? That's excellent. I love that. Yeah, that'll be a clip. That's good. Okay, let me just make sure I got what I need here. Okay. Oh, let's go back just a little bit on the history, because the book is focused a lot on history, and somewhat of it revolves around Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
Why was Hitler so concerned about cancer that he was willing to back a scientist researcher who was kind of the opposite of what he wanted? If you know what I mean. I'm not going to say that for censorship reasons, but
yeah. So, Hitler grew up in the late 19th century, as did my protagonist, Otto Warburg. And this was the time period that I was talking about when cancer started to become more and more common. So the Germans were at the forefront of science at the time, really the pinnacle of the scientific world. And they had been sort of figuring out all the infectious diseases that were so common at the time, tuberculosis first and foremost. And so they figured that out and made a lot of progress, but they couldn't make progress against cancer. And the sort of whole German scientific establishment became somewhat obsessed with cancer and saw that as the next great victory. And that's why I think Otto Warburg decided to try to find a cure for cancer. But this is the environment that Hitler grows up in. And then, when he's still a teenager, his mother is diagnosed with breast cancer. And, his mother was really the only person, historians say, that he was capable of loving, and he watched her fall apart. It was a gruesome, in those days, it was, much different to have cancer, and it was very few treatments. And his mother went through, just horrible treatments that he witnessed, and it had a lasting impact on him. And, he became a hypochondriac, and cancer was always sort of at the top of the list of things that he was afraid of. Stomach cancer was quite common at the time, and he had terrible stomach cramps. And so he was just obsessed with cancer at some points. At one point, like, sat down and wrote out his will because he was so sure that he was going to die of cancer. And, meanwhile, Otto Warburg, the protagonist of my book, has a Jewish father, I wouldn't say openly gay, but lives with his male partner, is, I think, understood to be gay by anybody who cares to pay attention. And so, when 1933 comes around, the Nazis come to power. A lot of Jewish scientists flee or chased out. But Warburg sticks around, and, he's incredibly arrogant. He says, I'm not going to let these Nazi thugs, chase me out. And he is tolerated despite his, really provocative behavior, kicking brown shirts out of his institute and stuff. And, there are different reasons he was tolerated at first, but eventually, I think it becomes clear that it was his cancer science that ultimately kept him alive. And the Nazis not only protected him, but, when bombs started to fall near his institute, they relocated him to this beautiful lake house and they built him a new laboratory. And it's really incredible. And I think it does come back to Hitler's fear of cancer, and other top Nazis sort of shared his paranoia. The Nazis were paranoid by disposition, and cancer was, Jews were one thing they were terrified of, and but cancer was another. And it is all these contradictions in one in Warburg's story.
That's very interesting. Very, very interesting. I have not had a chance to read the full book, but the parts that I did read, which was more of the diet related parts, are very interesting. So I'm very interested in going about and reading more of the history part of it. I think that's fascinating. Okay, so to sum everything up, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about where people can find you, and what other books you have out there, and what you plan on doing next.
Oh, sure. they can find me on Instagram at Sam Apple Books, on Twitter at Sam_Apple1. So those are my main sort of online places. My website, samapple.com. And the book is available wherever books are sold, I think. I'm taking a little break now from writing to, focus on my teaching and to do publicity for this book. But I do hope to, continue to write about these issues in various forms. I've done some features for Wired I did one on NUSI, this organization that was started by Gary Taubes to sort of investigate the low carb diet, and one on metformin, the diabetes drug, which is related to all of this. And I've done some stuff for other publications on low carb. My book actually started as a New York Times Magazine feature about Otto Warburg, and then I expanded it into a book. So I hope to keep writing about these issues for various publications. And I'm thinking about another book, which is maybe somewhat related, but I probably shouldn't talk about too much because I'm not sure yet. I'm still sort of in my period of recovery. I would call it the recovery. Yeah, it took me 5 years to write the book. So
wow.
Yeah. It was particularly difficult because so much of the source material was in German, and I'm not fluent in German, so
wow,
it was a challenge.
Wow. I totally understand that as a published author myself, but I wrote romance, fiction, which you don't have to have quite as much research. You have to do some research, but nothing like a nonfiction book with all the history and the issues you have. So I get that needing that downtime. But may I put a bug in your ear and just say, I would love to see you write a book about seed oils. That seems to be just a huge topic in the low carb, keto, carnivore community. So if you have any interest in that.
It's not a bad idea at all. I will let that bug sit in my ear.
And I'm sure there's some history you can pull in there too. So matter of fact, I know there is. So I think it would be a good one. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing about your book and diet and cancer. I think that is extremely important for people to know. And hey, while y'all are here, subscribe to my channel and go follow Sam. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Bye.
Okay, bye.